July 12, 1943. Somewhere in the Bay of Biscay, roughly 200 miles west of Brest, a German submarine was caught on the surface under a cloudless afternoon sky. Standing on the conning tower of U-441 was Senior Medical Officer Dr. Paul Feringer, a man whose naval career had been defined by bandages and scalpels, not tactics or command. As he held the railing, 3 RAF Beaufighters burst through the haze at low altitude, engines howling. Their cannons opened fire before the submarine's crew could even react. Fragments of metal tore across the bridge. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Hartmann, the boat's commander, was hit almost immediately. Blood spread across the steel plating as officers fell one by one. The alarm that should have signaled an emergency dive was never sounded. There would be no rapid descent into the safety of deep water. Within half a minute, the engagement was effectively over. 10 sailors were killed outright, 13 more were seriously wounded. Every commissioned officer aboard U-441, including Hartmann, was incapacitated. In the chaos that followed, command fell to the least expected man on the vessel. Dr. Feringer, whose entire combat preparation amounted to treating casualties after battles had already occurred, suddenly found himself responsible for keeping a shattered submarine and its surviving crew alive. He now faced the impossible task of guiding a damaged U-boat back to port through skies dominated by Allied aircraft. Hartmann would ultimately recover from his injuries. But Feringer's brief, improvised command would later be remembered as one of the most remarkable survival episodes of the U-boat war. This moment illustrated a brutal reality. The balance of power in the Atlantic had flipped with astonishing speed. Just 4 months earlier, German submarines still held a fighting chance. In early 1943, U-boats were equipped with METOX radar warning receivers, which could detect Allied aircraft at a distance. That early alert often provided 2 to 3 crucial minutes, enough time to initiate a crash dive and disappear beneath the surface. By the summer of 1943, that margin had vanished. Attacks now came without warning. The interval between the first sighting of enemy aircraft and destruction had shrunk from minutes to mere seconds. For U-boat crews, survival increasingly depended on luck rather than skill. Statistics reveal how dramatic the transformation was. During 1942, German submarines sank 1,094 Allied merchant ships, representing approximately 7.8 million tons of shipping. In exchange, only 87 U-boats were lost. This imbalance pushed Britain dangerously close to economic collapse and starvation. 12 months later, the situation was unrecognizable. In May 1943 alone, the German Navy lost 41 submarines while managing to sink only 34 merchant vessels. Losses mounted faster than replacements could be built or crews trained. The defeat was undeniable. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, ordered a withdrawal from the North Atlantic. The decision effectively marked Germany's concession in the Battle of the Atlantic. The cause of this collapse was not a single weapon, but a technological breakthrough measured in fractions of a minute. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of Germany's submarine fleet, was capable of performing an emergency dive in roughly 20 to 30 seconds under ideal conditions, reaching a depth of about 25 meters in just over half a minute. On paper, this was sufficient to evade air attack. In reality, those numbers were meaningless without advance warning. That warning disappeared in March 1943 when the Allies deployed centimetric radar, a new system operating on wavelengths completely invisible to German detection equipment. U-boats could no longer hear approaching aircraft electronically. By the time planes were seen, they were already attacking. What followed was not merely a tactical setback, but a decisive technological defeat. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Atlantic, once a German killing ground, had turned into a lethal trap for submarines struggling to survive in a sky now ruled by the enemy. In the middle of the Atlantic War, German submarine crews began facing a new and deadly reality: attacks that arrived without warning. A system that had protected U-boats for years, the ability to vanish beneath the surface, lost its value once aircraft could strike before a dive even began. This sudden shift in underwater warfare first revealed itself in late summer 1942. On August 27 of that year, Oberleutnant zur See Hans-Jürgen Hesse was on watch aboard U-94, cruising through the Caribbean. The sky above him appeared empty and calm. The submarine's methodical radar warning receiver, an early French-designed device capable of sensing Allied radar emissions from several miles away, showed no activity. By every technical measure, the boat seemed isolated and safe. Then came the sound. Without any visual warning, the low, unmistakable hum of aircraft engines echoed directly overhead. Hesse shouted the alarm, triggering chaos on the bridge. The crew rushed to execute an emergency dive. From the moment the American PBY Catalina was spotted to the order to submerge, less than 15 seconds passed. It was nowhere near enough time. As U-94's conning tower slicked below the waves, 4 650-pound depth charges detonated around the hull. The pressure crushed the submarine before it could reach safety. The Catalina's pilot, Lieutenant Gordon Fisk of Patrol Squadron VP-92, had approached silently from astern, an angle where the submarine's lookouts were least effective. In his combat report, he summarized the encounter with brutal simplicity. Target attempted emergency dive but failed. Those final words, "failed," would come to define submarine warfare over the next 3 years. Earlier in the war, German U-boat commanders operated with a strong sense of control. When running on the surface, doctrine required 4 sailors on the bridge, each responsible for monitoring a designated arc of sky and sea. Under clear conditions, skilled observers could detect aircraft 8 to 10 miles away, offering several minutes to react, more than enough time to dive safely. Few commanders demonstrated this system better than Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein, captain of U-156. Throughout much of 1942, while operating in the South Atlantic, Hartenstein's crew repeatedly avoided Allied patrol aircraft. His war diary records a pattern of calm efficiency. One entry from September describes a routine encounter. An aircraft spotted at approximately 8 miles distance, an immediate crash dive ordered, and the first depth charges detonating well over a minute after the submarine had submerged. By then, the boat was already deep and undamaged. That margin of time, often around 90 seconds, was critical. It allowed the bridge crew to descend safely, diesel engines to shut down correctly, and the submarine to reach a depth where aerial weapons were ineffective. Operational data from the period reinforced German confidence. Between February and October 1942, U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay completed roughly 4 out of 5 crossings without suffering any air attack at all. Even when aircraft did make contact, nearly 90% of submarines managed to dive clear before weapons could be released. But that era of predictability was ending. The encounter with U-94 signaled that the balance had shifted. Aircraft no longer needed to be seen to be lethal, and once surprise replaced warning, the sea itself stopped offering refuge. In the opening months of 1942, the appearance of the Allied ASV Mark II airborne radar did not immediately alarm German submarine commanders. Operating on a wavelength of roughly 1.7 meters, the system allowed patrol aircraft to locate surfaced submarines from distances of approximately 10 to 15 miles. While this represented a clear technological step forward for the Allies, it came with a critical weakness. German U-boats were equipped with the methodical radar warning receiver, a simple but effective device capable of detecting the emissions produced by the new radar. Skilled radio operators could interpret the incoming signals and even recognize when an aircraft had locked onto their position. As the sweeping pulses shifted into a steady rhythm, crews knew detection had occurred. This typically gave them a narrow window, often 2 or 3 minutes, to prepare for evasive action before the aircraft arrived overhead. Despite this warning capability, Allied aircrews faced a persistent operational dilemma during night patrols. Squadron leader Humphrey de Leigh identified the flaw clearly. Radar could guide an aircraft close to a submarine, but at the final moment when visual confirmation was essential, the radar contact disappeared. In those final seconds, the submarine would hear approaching engines, execute an emergency dive, and vanish beneath the surface, shielded by darkness. Leigh's response to this problem was strikingly straightforward. He proposed mounting an immensely powerful searchlight beneath the aircraft, designed to switch on at the precise instant radar contact was lost. The light, producing around 22 million candela, would suddenly flood the target area with illumination, leaving the submarine exposed and unable to react in time. This device would soon become known as the Leigh Light. The concept was put into combat use on June 4, 1942. Flying a Wellington bomber of No. 172 Squadron, Squadron leader J.H. Greswell used the Leigh Light to illuminate the Italian submarine Luigi Torelli in the Bay of Biscay. Although the attack failed due to malfunctioning depth charges, the encounter had an immediate psychological effect. For the first time, darkness could no longer be relied upon as protection. Just 1 month later, the system proved its deadly effectiveness. On July 5, 1942, Pilot Officer W. Howell of No. 502 Squadron surprised U-502 on the surface. From the moment the searchlight ignited, the submarine's commander, Captain Lieutenant Jürgen von Rosenstiel, had less than 20 seconds to respond before weapons struck. When U-502 was destroyed days later, recovered documents revealed the crew's disbelief and shock at being attacked at night without warning. The reason was simple but devastating. A Wellington aircraft flying at roughly 120 miles per hour could cover the final mile where radar contact failed in about half a minute. Once crew reaction time and the mechanics of initiating a dive were factored in, submarines were left with perhaps 15 to 20 seconds to submerge. That was nowhere near enough to reach a safe depth. By early 1943, the Allies had expanded the use of the Leigh Light dramatically. Under coordinated operations such as those over the Bay of Biscay, more than 130 aircraft equipped with the system were deployed on continuous patrols. In response, Admiral Dönitz altered standard U-boat procedures, instructing crews to surface during daylight hours and remain submerged at night. However, this adjustment merely shifted the danger rather than removing it. Losses continued to mount. March 1943 marked a decisive turning point. The Allies introduced the ASV Mark III radar, operating on a radically shorter wavelength of 10 centimeters. This breakthrough was made possible by cavity magnetron technology and, crucially, rendered the system invisible to German METOX receivers. Submarine crews soon began reporting attacks that occurred without any prior radar warning, an outcome German scientists initially dismissed as impossible, convinced no radar could function at such frequencies. One of the earliest confirmed cases occurred on March 6, 1943, when U-333 was attacked while transiting the Bay of Biscay. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Peter Erich Kremer, submitted a report that caused deep concern at U-boat headquarters. There had been no METOX alert. Allied aircraft appeared suddenly overhead, opening fire as the submarine attempted a crash dive. Casualties were severe. Within weeks, similar accounts arrived from across the Atlantic. Submarines were being caught on the surface in daylight, at night, and even in fog conditions under which they believed themselves effectively invisible. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. Once the element of warning was removed, the balance of time and distance worked entirely against the U-boats. The calculations were unforgiving. Detection without warning meant reaction times measured in seconds, not minutes. By the spring of 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Allied technology had closed the last gaps in submarine concealment, signaling the beginning of the end for large-scale U-boat operations in the Atlantic. By early 1943, the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively against German submarines. Allied long-range patrol aircraft, particularly the B-24 Liberator fitted with ASV Mark III radar, had turned the ocean surface into a lethal trap. These aircraft could detect a surfaced submarine from roughly 15 miles away and close the distance at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. From the first electronic contact to the moment weapons were released, the entire attack sequence often took less than 5 minutes. For U-boat crews, the reality was even harsher. If the submarine was spotted visually at close range, the time between seeing the aircraft and impact could be as little as 5 seconds, far too short to issue a dive command, let alone escape. Many boats were destroyed without ever sounding an alarm. The shock of this new reality was profound. Crews who had once trusted their warning receivers and lookout procedures now realized that their protective systems had become effectively useless. Confidence in technology collapsed, replaced by constant anxiety and suspicion. Some commanders responded by diving unpredictably, even when no threat was detected, hoping randomness might offer protection. But this tactic only worsened their situation. By May 1943, the Bay of Biscay, once a routine transit zone for submarines leaving French ports, had become infamous among U-boat crews, who grimly referred to it as the Valley of Death. Aircraft equipped with centimetric radar, powerful Leigh Lights, and improved anti-submarine weapons patrolled relentlessly. Between April and May alone, 56 German submarines were lost, many destroyed within sight of the very bases they had departed days earlier. The shrinking window between detection and attack had consequences beyond immediate losses. Forced to dive repeatedly and without warning, submarines drained their batteries at a catastrophic rate. A standard Type 7 U-boat could sustain a submerged speed of just over 7 knots for approximately 1 hour before its batteries were exhausted. Once power levels dropped, surfacing to recharge became unavoidable, and surfacing almost guaranteed another attack. The danger intensified further with the introduction of the Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo. Dropped from aircraft flying as low as 200 feet and at speeds up to 120 knots, this 680-pound weapon represented a major technological leap. Unlike traditional depth charges, which relied on proximity and timing, Fido actively searched for its target. Once in the water, it followed a circular patrol pattern, locking onto the 24 kHz sound signature of submarine propellers. Its effectiveness was undeniable. While conventional depth charges achieved success rates of around 9%, the Mark 24 reached approximately 22%. From May 1943 until the end of the war, these torpedoes sank 37 submarines and damaged at least 18 more, often striking boats that had already dived beyond the reach of earlier weapons. German countermeasures consistently lagged behind Allied innovations. The NECO's radar warning receiver, introduced in September 1943, could detect centimetric radar emissions, but only at distances of 5 to 8 kilometers. As aircraft approached speeds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour, this provided little meaningful warning. Worse still, the device proved fragile and unreliable under operational conditions, frequently failing when crews needed it most. Another attempted solution was the snorkel, adapted from captured Dutch technology and introduced operationally in early 1944. By allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, it reduced exposure on the surface. Yet this advance brought severe trade-offs. Submerged speed dropped to around 6 knots. Exhaust gases created visible disturbances on the water's surface. Inside the boat, engine noise reverberating through the narrow snorkel mast made it nearly impossible to hear approaching aircraft, eliminating acoustic awareness entirely. In desperation, Grand Admiral Dönitz issued a controversial order on April 27, 1943, instructing submarines to remain on the surface and fight attacking aircraft rather than diving. Several Type 7 boats were converted into so-called U-flak submarines, fitted with additional anti-aircraft guns. The concept failed almost immediately. The experience of U-441 on July 12, 1943 proved decisive. Despite reinforced armament, coordinated air attacks by multiple aircraft quickly overwhelmed the submarine, inflicting heavy damage and casualties. For many U-boat crews, acceptance came slowly. They struggled to believe that the technological edge they had relied upon for years had vanished almost overnight. But by mid-1943, the evidence was undeniable. The ocean that had once concealed them had become transparent, hostile, and unforgiving, and the era of German submarine dominance was coming to a brutal end. In early 1943, the German U-boat arm was already under strain, but few commanders yet understood how fundamentally the balance at sea was shifting. When the submarine U-333 reported in March that it had been attacked by aircraft without receiving any radar warning, the claim was quietly dismissed. Senior officers attributed the incident to faulty equipment, operator error, or battlefield confusion. At the time, Germany's scientific authorities were confident that Allied radar technology could not function at wavelengths below 50 centimeters. Anything shorter, they argued, was physically impractical. Even Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, initially shared this skepticism. Entries in his April 1943 war diary reveal a clear reluctance to accept repeated crew testimonies describing invisible attackers. The assumption remained that the methodical radar warning system still offered sufficient protection. This refusal to acknowledge a technological breakthrough would soon prove disastrous. Throughout April 1943, submarines continued operating under outdated tactical assumptions. Crews trusted their detection equipment and remained on the surface longer than was safe. U-175, U-192, and U-273 were all destroyed that month, their commanders convinced until the last moments that any approaching aircraft would be detected in time. The losses mounted rapidly, and desperation began to influence doctrine. One of the most radical responses was the order for submarines to fight aircraft while surfaced an idea that contradicted decades of submarine warfare principles. The conversion of U-441 into a heavily armed anti-aircraft platform symbolized this shift. Additional cannons and reinforced gun crews were meant to turn vulnerability into deterrence. Reality proved otherwise. On July 12, 1943, coordinated Allied air attacks overwhelmed the boat's defenses. 3 attacking aircraft neutralized the submarine's firepower with ease, killing 10 crewmen and seriously wounding 13 more. The experiment had failed. By the autumn of 1943, even the most optimistic officers were forced to accept the truth. The technological contest had been lost. The deployment of American escort carriers closed what had once been a relatively safe mid-Atlantic gap. Continuous air patrols now covered areas that submarines had previously navigated with confidence. This realization was captured with brutal honesty by Wolfgang Luth, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, credited with sinking over 200,000 tons of Allied shipping. In his final patrol report, he summarized the new reality without illusion. The enemy could locate German submarines without being detected in return. Attacks came suddenly without warning, and survival was no longer determined by skill or equipment but by chance. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was profound. Songs and bravado gave way to grim humor and fatalism. Submarines were no longer seen as weapons of victory, but as sealed steel tombs. By 1944, statistical analysis painted a horrifying picture. The average crewman could expect to survive only 3 patrols. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm during the war, 28,000 would never return, a casualty rate of nearly 70%, higher than any other military branch in any nation during World War II. Behind these losses lay not just strategy but physics and timing. A crash dive aboard a Type 7 U-boat was an intricate, rehearsed emergency procedure where seconds meant life or death. The moment danger was spotted, the bridge watch triggered the alarm. An electric klaxon echoed through the hull as crewmen sprinted to assigned stations. The conning tower had to be cleared in under 12 seconds, with men descending the ladder in strict order to avoid jams. Inside the control room, ballast tank vents were opened while the negative tank, a massive 70-ton auxiliary tank in the bow, was flooded. The dive planes were forced to their maximum downward angle of 30 degrees, and spare crew rushed forward to add weight and force the bow down faster. Every action had to be perfectly synchronized. If the descent angle became too steep, battery acid could spill, releasing deadly chlorine gas. If too shallow, depth charges would detonate close enough to tear the hull apart. Allied aircraft learned to exploit every weakness in this process. The ASV Mark III radar, operating at a frequency of 9.1 GHz with a wavelength of just 3.2 centimeters, was completely undetectable by German warning systems. In calm seas, it could identify a surfaced submarine from 15 miles away. Once within a mile, the aircraft's Leigh Light, producing an astonishing 50 million candle power, automatically switched on, flooding the target with blinding light. From first illumination to weapon impact, U-boats often had less than 25 seconds to react. The attack on U-758 on June 8, 1943 illustrated this new and deadly reality. After transmitting the location of convoy Gus 9 south of the Azores, the submarine was suddenly assaulted by aircraft from the escort carrier USS Bogue. For over half an hour, the boat remained trapped on the surface under relentless attack. Some crewmen fought desperately at anti-aircraft guns while others prepared for an emergency dive that might never come. By then, the outcome of the battle beneath the Atlantic was no longer in doubt. Only the arrival of overwhelming Allied firepower finally forced U-758 into a successful emergency dive. By then, the damage was already severe. 7 crewmen had been wounded, leaving the submarine no choice but to abandon its patrol and limp back to port. Similar scenes were becoming increasingly common. On October 20, 1943, U-256 was caught on the surface by aircraft operating from the escort carrier USS Block Island. The crew attempted an immediate crash dive, but the maneuver failed. During the attack, the boat's commander, Captain Lieutenant Wilhelm Bruhl, was killed and several sailors were injured. Later entries in the submarine's war diary reveal a deep sense of disbelief among the crew. Despite having detection systems in working order, they had been struck without any meaningful warning, an unsettling sign that the balance of the undersea war had shifted. Perhaps the most dramatic illustration of how little time U-boats now had to react occurred on January 28, 1944. That day, German submarine U-571 and an Australian Sunderland flying boat destroyed each other in a matter of seconds. Flight Lieutenant R.D. Lucas first picked up the submarine on radar from approximately 12 miles away. Using cloud cover to mask his approach, Lucas descended undetected and burst through the clouds at a distance of only 800 yards. From that moment, U-571 had just 18 seconds before weapons were released. As the submarine began to submerge and its conning tower slipped beneath the surface, disaster struck both sides. The Sunderland's port wing collided with the submarine's aerial wire. The impact proved fatal to both vessels. U-571 sank with all 52 men aboard, while the Sunderland crashed into the sea, killing 11 of its crew. The encounter demonstrated how brutally compressed the window for survival had become. This shrinking margin reached its most catastrophic point during what German sailors would later call Black May of 1943. In that single month, the U-boat force lost 41 submarines. The engagement around convoy ONS-5 made the reality unmistakable. Between May 4 and May 6, 17 German submarines attempted to attack the convoy. The result was devastating. 6 U-boats were sunk, 11 more were damaged, and not a single Allied merchant ship was lost. The numbers from the battle told a stark story. The average warning time before an aerial attack was just 8 seconds. Only 31% of attempted crash dives succeeded. Successful torpedo attacks, none. The traditional tactics of submarine warfare had effectively collapsed. On May 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Dönitz acknowledged this reality in his diary. He admitted that new Allied detection systems and weapons had stripped Germany of its only effective offensive tool at sea. Until technological innovations could restore parity, he concluded, the submarine campaign had to be curtailed. From that point forward, U-boat patrols became less about attacking enemy shipping and more about simply staying alive. Life aboard the submarines changed accordingly. Crews remained submerged for as long as 20 hours a day, surfacing only briefly to ventilate the hull and recharge batteries. Even these short appearances on the surface often triggered immediate attacks. The introduction of the Schnorchel in 1944 reduced the need for full surfacing, but it brought a new set of dangers. Maintaining the correct depth was critical. If the submarine descended too far, the schnorchel valve would slam shut, creating a vacuum capable of rupturing eardrums. If it rode too high, the snorkel head left a visible wake one that aircraft could spot from miles away. Operational statistics from 1944 reflect just how radically submarine warfare had changed. Average daily time on the surface dropped to about 45 minutes, compared to roughly 16 hours in 1942. Patrol speeds fell from 10 knots to just 4. Most telling of all, the ratio of merchant ships sunk per U-boat lost collapsed to 0.7, down from an astonishing 12.6 only 2 years earlier. The consequences went far beyond individual sinkings. With submarines forced to remain submerged and slow, coordinated wolfpack attacks became unworkable. Commerce raiding the very heart of Germany's naval strategy ceased to be viable. The Battle of the Atlantic was ultimately decided not by courage or numbers, but by technology. Once the crash-dive window narrowed to mere seconds, Germany's hope of severing Allied supply lines vanished. On the Allied side, especially in the United States, anti-submarine warfare underwent a rapid transformation. Early in the war, American air crews were inexperienced and inefficient hunters. By late 1943, they had become lethal professionals. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville, flight crews trained against real submarines. Practice attacks were recorded on film, then analyzed in detail. Any crew that took longer than 35 seconds from first sighting to weapon release was deemed a failure and required to repeat the exercise. The results were measurable. By the end of 1943, American aircraft achieved an average of 1 U-boat kill for every 40 attack sorties, a 5-fold improvement over the ratio of 1 kill per 200 sorties in 1942. The deployment of escort carriers completed the transformation. These small carriers extended air cover deep into the mid-Atlantic, eliminating the so-called air gap that submarines had once exploited. The air group of USS Bogue alone accounted for 13 U-boat sinkings over 2 years. Together, these developments proved that air power could now reach any point in the Atlantic Ocean, and that the era of the U-boat as a dominant offensive weapon had come to an end. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hopgood, one of the officers who played a central role in shaping early American anti-submarine warfare doctrine, later explained how the nature of the battle beneath the Atlantic fundamentally changed. According to him, naval aviation crews were forced to abandon the slow thinking of traditional naval combat. Time was no longer measured in minutes, but in fleeting seconds. Every checklist, maneuver, and attack pattern was relentlessly optimized to eliminate delay. Intelligence estimates showed that a German U-boat typically required around 20 seconds to complete an emergency dive. Allied aircrews understood that their entire mission revolved around stealing those seconds away. By January 10, 1945, this philosophy translated into new technology and tactics. Patrol Squadron VPB 1110 became the first U.S. unit to operationally deploy the Leigh Light, a powerful searchlight that transformed night attacks. U-boats that once vanished into darkness were suddenly exposed at the most vulnerable moment on the surface, caught between detection and escape. Alongside new equipment, crews refined deception techniques designed to manipulate enemy perception. One of the most effective was the so-called false engine approach. Pilots would reduce throttle during the run-in, making the aircraft seem farther away than it truly was. At the last instant, engines roared back to full power, leaving submarine crews with no time to react. This was not just tactical innovation, but psychological warfare. By the later years of the conflict, many U-boat crews were already exhausted, anxious, and deeply traumatized. These sudden attacks exploited that mental strain with devastating efficiency. Yet technology and tactics alone did not explain the collapse of the German submarine campaign. The decisive shift came from intelligence, specifically Ultra. The Allied ability to read encrypted German naval communications reshaped the mathematics of survival at sea. The first major success occurred in June 1941, when British codebreakers penetrated the so-called Dolphin cipher. That advantage briefly disappeared in February 1942, when the German Navy introduced the far more complex 4-rotor shark cipher. The turning point came later that year, at extraordinary human cost. In October 1942, during the final moments of the sinking submarine U-559, Lieutenant Francis Fasson and able seaman Colin Grazier from HMS Petard boarded the damaged vessel in rough seas. They recovered vital codebooks and documents, fully aware that the submarine could sink at any moment. When it did, both men drowned. Their actions, however, allowed Allied cryptanalysts to restore consistent access to U-boat communications by December 1942. Once ultra-intelligence flowed reliably, the nature of the campaign changed irreversibly. Submarines were increasingly intercepted while still en route to their patrol zones. With Ultra, 73% of U-boats were detected during transit compared to only 21% without it. The average delay between a position report and an air attack dropped to roughly 4 hours. In many cases, entire convoys were diverted away from Wolfpack ambushes, successfully avoiding contact 67% of the time. This intelligence dominance meant that even flawless emergency dives rarely saved a submarine. Diving simply delayed destruction. Boats forced underwater by aircraft were often located again hours later and attacked repeatedly until destruction was inevitable. The statistics trace the transformation with brutal clarity. In 1942, Germany still held the advantage. Approximately 250 U-boats were operational. Allied shipping losses reached 194 merchant vessels, while German losses stood at 87 submarines. This produced an exchange ratio of 12.6 merchant ships sunk for every U-boat lost. Submarine crews typically received around 3 minutes 180 seconds of warning before an air attack. Nearly 89% of crash dives succeeded. The following year marked the decisive reversal. In 1943, the operational U-boat fleet expanded to roughly 425 boats, yet Allied losses fell dramatically. Merchant ships sunk totaled 363, while U-boat losses skyrocketed to 258. The exchange ratio collapsed to 1.4 ships per submarine. Average warning time dropped to just 15 seconds. Successful emergency dives fell to 31%. By 1944 and 1945, the campaign had disintegrated entirely. With approximately 375 U-boats operational, German submarines managed to sink only 132 merchant vessels while losing 344 boats. The exchange ratio inverted, just 0.38 ships sunk per U-boat lost. Warning time before attack shrank to 5 seconds. Only 15% of crash dives succeeded. Out of the 1,162 U-boats commissioned during the war, 785 were destroyed, a loss rate of 67.5%. Aircraft alone were responsible for approximately 250 of these losses, with another 100 attributed to combined air-surface operations. The human cost was even more devastating. Roughly 40,000 men served aboard German submarines during the war. Of them, an estimated 28,000 never returned, a fatality rate of nearly 70%, one of the highest of any branch in modern military history. Herbert Werner, a rare survivor who served aboard 5 different U-boats and later chronicled his experience in Iron Coffins, captured the psychological transformation of the campaign. What began as a war of confident predators ended as a struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. Life aboard a U-boat became a countdown. Existence was measured not in days or patrols, but in the fragile seconds between detection and destruction. At first, those seconds offered hope. In the end, they vanished altogether. Only a small fraction of those who entered the submarine war survived it. Vera was among that minority, one of roughly 7,000 men who returned from a force of nearly 40,000. His later writings offer rare insight into the invisible damage carried home from the Atlantic. Even decades after the war had ended, sleep brought no peace. In his dreams, alarms still rang out, orders were shouted, and the boat plunged downward again and again, forever trapped in emergency dives that never truly ended. One of the central figures in U-boat history, Dr. Paul Pluffinger, played a decisive role during the crisis of July 12, 1943, when U-441 was gravely damaged in an Allied air assault. His actions during the 31-hour struggle to return the shattered submarine to port saved the lives of nearly everyone aboard. After the war, Pluffinger resumed civilian life, becoming a respected physician in Hamburg. In a 1976 interview, he reflected on that night with stark clarity. He believed that those desperate hours at sea had resulted in more lives saved than his entire medical career combined. The warning time, he recalled, was almost non-existent, perhaps 5 seconds from detection to attack. 5 seconds that separated survival from annihilation. At a reunion of former U-boat personnel held in Munich in 1985, veterans gathered to speak openly about experiences rarely discussed. Reinhard Hardigan, once commander of U-23 during successful patrols along the American coastline, summarized the abrupt reversal of fortunes. Within a matter of months, he said, German submarines transitioned from dominant predators to hunted prey. The very technologies that once allowed them to vanish beneath the surface in moments were stripped away. Once that brief interval of invisibility disappeared, submarines ceased to be elusive weapons and became exposed targets. The history of the U-boat campaign provides enduring lessons for modern military planners. Many contemporary weapons systems rely on similarly narrow technological advantages, margins measured in seconds rather than minutes. The conclusion remains unchanged across generations. Any advantage based on timing alone is temporary. When survival depends on a shrinking window of reaction, vulnerability is inevitable. For this reason, the collapse of the German submarine force is now widely studied as a textbook example of technological disruption in warfare. Modern stealth aircraft, cyber capabilities, and advanced submarine fleets operate under the same fundamental constraint. Their effectiveness lasts only until a countermeasure is discovered, refined, and deployed. Today, the final surviving type submarine, U-995, rests as a museum vessel at the Leibo Naval Memorial near Kiel. Visitors walk through its narrow passageways, surrounded by steel walls where crews once measured their lives in seconds. Near the conning tower, a simple plaque commemorates the approximately 28,000 German submariners who never returned from the sea. The disappearance of the U-boat's crash-dive advantage stands as one of the clearest demonstrations in military history of technology shaping outcomes. Between 1942 and 1943, Allied innovations relentlessly compressed German reaction time, first reducing minutes to seconds and then eliminating warning entirely. By March 1943, the introduction of centimetric radar removed the final element of surprise. From that moment onward, the U-boat fleet was no longer a viable strategic weapon. Behind this technological shift were deeply human stories. Dr. Paul Pluffinger assuming emergency command of a crippled submarine and guiding it home through darkness and flooding. Crews manning deck guns despite knowing air superiority made resistance futile. The fatal encounter that destroyed both U-571 and its attacker. These episodes illustrate how personal bravery, when overtaken by superior systems, becomes statistically meaningless. The consequences extended far beyond individual battles. As the escape window vanished, so did Germany's last realistic chance to sever Allied supply routes. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Winston Churchill later described as the decisive struggle of the entire war, was ultimately resolved not through superior seamanship or courage, but through the systematic compression of time made possible by scientific progress. At the war's outset, German submarines possessed a dependable means of survival: the rapid crash dive, allowing them to evade aircraft and disappear beneath the surface. This capability shaped naval doctrine and enabled coordinated wolfpack attacks that brought Britain dangerously close to starvation. Yet the same scientific momentum that once favored the submarine reversed its fortunes. Radar, sonar, improved aircraft, and acoustic torpedoes erased the underwater refuge entirely. For those who endured this transformation, the loss of those few critical seconds defined their existence. In 1942, warning times were measured in minutes. By mid-1943, they were counted in seconds. By 1944, there was no warning at all. Victory in the Atlantic was forged as much in laboratories and factories as it was on open water. British researchers perfecting radar, American industrial workers producing patrol aircraft by the thousands, intelligence teams breaking encrypted German communications. Together, they closed the U-boat's final avenue of escape. The triumph was gradual rather than dramatic, calculated instead of heroic. Yet even within this mechanized contest, moments of humanity endured. Allied aircrews dropping life rafts to enemy survivors, submarine crews remaining at their stations despite impossible odds. Mutual respect exchanged between adversaries who understood the shared risk of the sea. These moments remind us that even in wars driven by technology and statistics, human dignity persists. And they underscore the enduring truth revealed by the U-boat campaign. When warfare becomes a contest of seconds, the side that controls time ultimately controls history. When Germany committed its submarine fleet to the conflict, it did so with absolute confidence. The U-boat arm was presented as the pinnacle of naval warfare: highly trained crews, advanced engineering, and a belief that the ocean itself was their shield. These submarines were designed to vanish beneath the surface before danger could strike. Yet, by the war's end, that once feared force had been reduced to fragments of its former strength. From the French Atlantic ports, young sailors departed with songs, optimism, and a belief in inevitable victory. Statistically, most of them would never see land again. Nearly 70% of those crews were lost at sea, not because of hesitation or lack of bravery, but because the pace of technological change quietly overtook them. Their deaths were measured in moments. Innovations in detection and attack erased the narrow window of time submarines relied on to escape. The seconds required to submerge, once sufficient, were suddenly not enough. What had once been a reliable survival margin vanished almost overnight. Modern nuclear-powered submarines operate under entirely different assumptions. They rarely surface at all, rendering the emergency dive a relic of history. But immunity is an illusion. Today's fleets face threats of a different nature: satellites that never blink, seabed sensor arrays that listen continuously, and autonomous underwater systems that may one day shrink reaction time as brutally as radar and patrol aircraft once did. The lost crews of the U-boat fleet serve as silent witnesses to a timeless warning. They trusted that their technological edge would protect them. Instead, that same reliance became their undoing when the balance shifted. In war driven by innovation, advantages decay rapidly. What once offered safety soon becomes exposure. What dominates today may destroy tomorrow. The cruel paradox is unmistakable. The most effective submarine campaign ever conducted did not collapse due to inferior skill, weaker resolve, or lack of courage. It was undone by something far more precise: the removal of less than 60 seconds of warning. Lookouts who once counted heartbeats were defeated by engineers who reduced detection time to measurable fractions. Those lost seconds reshaped naval warfare and altered the course of history. The lesson of the 45-second crash dive is not limited to the past. It echoes beyond submarines and beyond war. Change is relentless and permanence is an illusion. The German submarine force paid for this truth with devastating losses: over 28,000 lives extinguished as their buffer of survival narrowed from minutes to seconds and finally to nothing at all. Their fate stands as a lasting reminder: in the world of military technology, time is never guaranteed. The seconds you depend on today may already be gone tomorrow.